safe. Hello everyone, we are starting now with Joan Jonas. And I would like to add something concerning the program of Open Forum. We are going to have, because as you know, each Open Forum are recorded. We are going to have an exhibition with some recordings of the last 13 years of Open Forum. It's going to be in March, the 22nd of March, till the 4th of April. And this recording will be part of our exhibition. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank Anne-Katrina Dolman for really being responsible for me being here, inviting me to Norway this time. And tonight I will first show a series of slides, because I don't want to switch back and forth between the medium of DVD and slides. You never know what's going to happen. And so I always improvise my talks, so here goes. And I'll give you an overview by showing you the slides of my work. Maybe some of you know it, maybe some of you don't. So I began to perform in the late 60s, and I chose the medium of the mirror as my first medium, the prop of the mirror. And I was inspired by Borges. I'm not going to describe what's happening in every image. It would take too long. I was inspired by the writings of Borges. And later on I'll show you a part of a remake of one of my mirror performances, and talk a little bit about the idea of re-performing something from a long time ago. So these are all images from the mirror pieces, which were performed in gymnasiums, and the performers were all artists, really friends and fellow artists. And I worked with, those are the people that I worked with in my early performances. A second medium that I segued into was the medium of landscape, deep landscape space. And I began in 1970 to work in landscape, and at the same time I went to Japan and bought a portapack, and so I began working with video and landscape at the same time. But I didn't call it landscape there, it was just space. I always work with space. And the mirror for me was a way to fragment space, to alter space. And what I've really always mainly been interested in is how does the medium alter the image? I'm not really interested in just simply presenting an image. I'm interested in how I can manipulate it and alter it. And so the mirrors reflected the space, reflected the performers, and made a kind of cubist surface. And the deep landscape space, I worked with the idea of distance. What are things in the distance? So these photographs are not in the distance because you wouldn't be able to see it in a photograph. But for instance, one of the main ideas in these landscape or pieces of outdoor works, I call them outdoor works, was the sound delay, the idea of the delayed signal, which also exists in video. So it's interesting to link these two mediums. And so this is, after my trip to Japan, I was influenced by the use of wood to create sounds. And so this is performers clapping blocks of wood together at different distances from the audience. And as you've all experienced, the sound is delayed in different ways depending on the atmosphere and on the distance. And these are just simply other images from this performance. I also started working with masks after visiting Japan. And this piece was called the Jones Beach piece. And then I was inspired by Houdini. This is a person being rolled around in a hoop. And holding a mirror on a ladder. After I visited Japan, I made this piece, and it has elements that were influences from seeing the No Theater in Japan. So here people are running back and forth on a rope at a diagonal from the audience. I was interested in how space flattens the image, which also is another quality of early video, the Sony Portapack, where it creates a very flat image. So I redo my pieces in different spaces and alter them, and this is the same performance in Rome. The performance was on one side of the river, and the audience was on the other side of the river. And for instance, in this, here I am explaining all the images, but in this image, there's a rope that was stretched across the river. It was on the name of the river. You all know the river in Rome. And it had a piece of wood attached to the middle of it. And I thought that we would be able to pull it out during the performance, but there were 6 men holding onto this rope and trying to pull it out of the water throughout the whole performance, and they couldn't pull it out. So that became part of the performance, the force of the river. And here I am drifting down. Another outdoor performance, which all these ideas are somehow incorporated into the final work, which was in New York, looking down from a cliff into a shape, a triangular shape, at the circle and the line, 2 motifs that I used over and over again. And the circle is made by running in the sand. The line was made by these pieces of wood we found on the beach. I might show you a video of that some later. So this is the same piece. It was called Delay, Delay, and it was performed in downtown New York in a warehouse district. After all the warehouses were torn down, there were some loft buildings left. So the audience saw the piece from the roof of a loft building. I was always interested in finding ways to place the audience either at a distance or above. So this combines the 2 different ideas of being above and far away. And as you can see, a circle and a line. I mean, just to mention a name, that's Gordon Matta Clark drawing the circle. Just, you know, I could mention now the downtown scene in New York in the 60s and 70s was a very wonderful situation of all kinds of different artists working in different medium, music, performance, film, dance, painters, sculptors, and everyone knew each other. It was a small community, and in my generation, we helped each other. Now that doesn't exist anymore for my generation. This is a performance when I reported back in Japan. I started working with video. So this is 1972, and it was a piece called Organic Honey's Visual Telepathy. But I changed it and worked on it in different locations over a period of 2 years. And the main idea in this is that the camera picks up a detail of the whole, and the audience saw the live performance simultaneously with a live detail of the performance. Very carefully rehearsed and framed in the rehearsals, so it wasn't at all improvised or random. All my pieces, just to make it clear, they're not improvised, they're rehearsed, and I make an attempt to perform it almost exactly as I rehearsed it, but there's always slight differences, and also, in order to be not so tight, there's a kind of looseness appearing. It appears to be a kind of looseness to it, and these are other versions of that piece. Organic Honey was a character. I was working with the idea of searching whether or not there's such a thing as female imagery. In this, it was during the women's movement, and it was a very strong movement, and we were all very involved with questions of the place of women and the roles that women play. So this piece is all about role playing, and the idea that I could change. For me, Organic Honey was my alter ego, which I constructed with masks and costumes. So in order to perform, I had to, in a way you could say, pretend I was someone else, not me. I didn't want to be Joan Jonas. I wanted to be someone else. It had to be, in that way, a kind of disguise, and also a kind of distancing from the audience. Again, this is another, so for a number of years, until 1976, I played and experimented with the relation of performance to video. So this is another piece called Funnel, in which, in the previous piece I used projections also, but in this piece there was just a video monitor and a stage set. I began to work with stage set. So sometimes I'm not going to talk about the images. It takes too long. I then in 1976, stopped working with video. I experimented with black and white video, which is what was available. The Portapac was just black and white. Although I had a color camera from Castelli Gallery that I made some color footage with, but mainly all my work, I worked in video, performance, and what I've done continually over the years is to reinterpret or translate performances into video, autonomous video works, and to insert back into the performances elements of the videos that I developed separately from the performances. So it's a constant kind of translating back and forth from performance to video, and I still work that way. And this is a piece called Juniper Tree based on a Grimm Brothers fairy tale that this is my loft, and I made a stage set. The paintings were made during the performance, and they're, this is a performance in the Whitechapel Gallery. If any of you have seen it now, this is the way it looked in 1976. It was a beautiful space. And this is actually, this is the installation of that same piece, and it now exists. It was bought by the Tate just to say that now my performances have taken on a slightly different life, some of them. Because I always wanted to, I'm not a performer who believes in, my performances are transitory because you can never experience the performance as it was. On the other hand, I really want the ideas of the performance to live on and to be experienced in a different way. But the way you would experience a videotape of my performance would not be the same way it was experienced when it was originally done. This is a piece called Volcano Saga, and it was based on an Icelandic saga in the 80s. I worked on this. And I did extensive research. Somebody told me how beautiful the sagas was, so I read them, as many as I could that were translated, and I chose the Laxadela Saga, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with this Laxadela Saga. It's the only one I know which is based on the life of a woman, which is why I chose it. And I went to Iceland, and if any of you know Steina Vasilka, who's a video artist, really introduced me to Iceland. She's from Iceland. And when I got the grant to do this piece, I called her up and she was going to Iceland. So my introduction to Iceland was driving along the southern coast with Steina, which was great. And then I went back later with a film crew. So this is the performance that I worked on for a number of years, and with video projections and slide projections. And I'm sorry I don't have the video, it's not functioning. But then I developed a single channel work for television, and I worked with Tilda Swinton and Ron Voder from the Worcester Group as actors in the piece. I was also in the piece, but in a minor part. So this was just recently shown in London. But these are all images from the performance. And again, this was made in 1994, and in Amsterdam I was asked to do a show of my work, and so it was, how to figure that out. So I translated, I think, 5 of my early pieces into installations, and then became really more interested in, and also simultaneously interested in, developing this form of work that could be, because when you work on performances, you work for 2 years, and you do a performance and 200 people see it. No, more people saw it, but in one way, I would like to have more people experience my work. So I like the idea of having it in a situation in which people can go in and out in a different way. And also it's a different, now I more and more think of my work in terms of a place that people can go into and not have one point of view, a frontal situation. So these are installation shots of Volcano Saga. I did a series of pieces called My New Theater, and they're boxes that are sitting on legs, and they're related to my early cones. I worked with the shape of cones because the form interested me. And they're called My New Theater because I make a video that is playing inside this box. I thought of it as something that could exist. My New Theater could go around without me. Because in the 90s, when I started developing these pieces, I thought, I don't want to travel anymore and do my performances. But it's not really the same thing. And they can't travel around like a little box that's easily portable. But I've made 6 of these in different versions, and there's a different video made especially for these theaters. And that's my dog. You can just see it jumping through a hoop. And this is an installation, just an image of an installation I did in Italy, based on a performance that I did in Como, Italy. This is a piece called Lines in the Sand. It was developed for Documenta 11. And it was an installation with video and later a performance. So it was based on, I began to work with epic poems. Before this, I worked on an epic Irish poem. And so when I was invited to be in this Documenta, I was asked to choose another epic poem. So this is based on the American poet H.D., Hilda Doolittle, because I wanted to work with an American. I often work with European texts. And she lived in the 30s. She was analyzed by Freud. And she wrote a book called Tribute to Freud. And she wrote a very long poem called Helen in Egypt. And I took excerpts from those 2 books because the poem, it's a very beautiful poem, and I liked the juxtaposition of the prose of Tribute to Freud. And also, I wish I could play part of it. I don't have it with me. It's very beautiful writing about her being analyzed by him in the 30s. Another aspect of working with material from this period is I was born in 1936, so I have a really direct relationship to this time. And the idea of being analyzed by Freud and this woman who lived at that time and was in the world of poetry at that time. I showed it in different galleries later on. This couch I have in many different pieces. It became, first of all, it's a kitchen couch from Nova Scotia where I go in the summer. And people build them, they put them in their kitchens, and the men lie on them while the women cook, I think. And so I remade it in New York, and then I used it in several different locations. So for Lines in the Sand, it was both the Egyptian couch and the Freudian couch. And by the way, Helen in Egypt is about the idea of Helen of Troy, who didn't go to Troy. She went to Egypt instead. And that's an old story. It's not a new story. It's a classical, it's from the classics. And therefore, Helen of Troy was not responsible for the Trojan War. So they always wanted to blame a woman for the Trojan War. But actually, she didn't go to Troy. So, well, this is just a line that the war was fought for a phantom. And I was interested in this. This is in the early 2003. It was just when 9/11 happened. And then, you know, they always tell you the wrong reason that they're going to war. We invaded Iraq. And for the wrong reason. And actually, it's interesting, for the same reason, for oil. They invaded Troy because of trading. Because that's what Robert Graves says. Anyway. So I take these old stories. This is from the performance of the same piece. So instead of going to Egypt, I went to Las Vegas. And because there's a really vulgar casino called Luxor, and it has a pyramid and a big sphinx in front of it. And I found some old ruins. Another link is my grandmother went to Egypt in 1910 and took a series of photographs, which I used in the performance, to represent the real Egypt, as opposed to the copy, which is Las Vegas. So there are these parallels. I'm going to show you this video later, so I won't talk too much about it. It was based on a trip that Abby Warburg took to the Southwest in 1900, and to visit the Hopi Indians. And I'll read you a text later, and I won't repeat myself. But this was a piece that was commissioned by Dia Beacon, and it was made especially for that space in Dia, which is a very big factory space with a very deep viewpoint, and the audience. I'll show you a video later, sorry. This is the installation I made from that performance. It's called The Shape, the Scent, the Feel of Things. And the installation is quite different in appearance, and also what I do is I began to use these video backdrops in my work. So instead of there being a live camera continuously, there are video backdrops that are composed especially to add another layer to the narrative. So you experience the narrative that's going on live. You'll see an example of that in the video, as well as what's going on in the video backdrop. So it's a kind of doubling. There were always the layers in the early work as well, but this time it's slightly different. This is the installation. This is a piece based on Dante, and it was the first. I did a whole project based on Dante, which was shown in Bergen last year. Some of you may have seen it. And this is the first installation version of that. So I work with, over a period of years with my, developing a piece through performance, through installation, until finally I reach a point. This is the final installation of Dante, where I feel that it's reached a point where I can leave it and go on to the next. So again, this is a series of several different projections with a stage set, elements from the performance. I'm moving quickly because And these drawings, from the very beginning of I'll read something about drawings later, thank you. Sorry. These drawings were developed in the Dante performances, and they were drawn live, which is what I had done from the very beginning. And constructed by layering all these different drawings together that I made in the performances. And so whenever I do a piece, I find a new way of making a drawing, actually. And the drawing has a relationship to the medium, to the content of the piece, to the space, and so on. For instance, these are trees that I drew for the first kind of animation for the performance. There. So now we can leave this aspect. Okay, good. Now, what I'm going to do now is, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to show you a piece. My very first, it was a film actually, it was shot by Peter Campus, but my very first piece, it was based on a performance I did called Wad Lao, which was a place I went in Morocco. But the name of this piece is Wind. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read it's a silent piece. Maybe we should can you turn them down a little bit? Thank you. My work consists of fragments and chants as much as material and technology. In the late 60s, after studying art history and sculpture, I became inspired by the idea of performance and began to work with time as material, transferring my concerns with drawing and the object into movement. At the time, as I wrote in the early 80s, I didn't see a major difference between a poem, a sculpture, a film, or a dance. I had to make that statement then because I wanted people to read my work the way they read these other forms, a sort of overlapping of readings. I had to show how natural it was for me to step from one form to another. Of course, there is a difference between a poem, a sculpture, a film, or a dance. I wanted something that was not dance, not sculpture, not theater. In 1994, while working with Doreen Mignon, the curator of my retrospective at the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam, I told her, when I started to think about performance in 1966, I went to Crete because of the Minoan culture. I went to a wedding ceremony in the mountains that lasted for 3 days. It was a ritual. I was always interested in folk culture because it is part of everyday life, and anybody can be part of it. You don't have to be special to do it. My performance came from trying to communicate this experience with my friends. What I remember is that on the night before the wedding, the men outdoors sang to the guests as they arrived, walking and riding donkeys up the mountain, carrying gifts. I was especially interested in this particular wedding ritual because it was not separated from the ongoing activities of daily life. They sang across the rocky landscape. I had initially gone to Crete because I was interested in the imagery of early art forms, like the small figures representing a Cretan mother goddess. In the 60s, I also traveled to the Southwest, to the Hopi Reservation in Arizona, to see the Hopi snake dance. My reaction was complicated. I remember now the profound effect this dance, a ritual with live snakes, had on me, as did the architecture of the pueblos and the vast desert landscape. At the same time, I found this situation disturbing. I remember noticing that the audience of mainly white tourists wore huge squash blossom necklaces they had purchased at the pawn shops. Were we an intrusion? Of course. The event was changed by our presence. Not long after that, outsiders were not allowed to witness the snake dance ceremony. I am very grateful to have been permitted to see these rituals carried forth from a time in which there was a direct relation with and communication to the land and the environment and the elements. I also saw a ceremony where costumed figures who were far away in the desert suddenly were close up on the plaza dancing. What was striking to me was how these images from afar could be brought back home. What became apparent and of interest was how to be in one place and think of another. Other references for me were the circus and the magic shows that I saw as a child, and the idea of alchemy or transformation of material and psyche. I especially liked sleight-of-hand visual tricks that could be special effects. Perhaps I always liked to have a reason in relation to structure and content. Something made it happen, even if we don't know, can't see what it was. I like to reveal the mechanics of the illusion. I like to juxtapose high-tech with the original gesture. In that way, the touch, the body, and the machine are put into play. Performance as a medium somehow exists between conceptual art and theater. For performance, a genre of multiple media, the critical material is time. This is said in the context of the visual arts, my context. My link to performance began with seeing Klaus Oldenburg's Store Days, a performance. Then a piece by Lucinda Childs. A chord was struck. I tried to see as much dance and performance as possible in order to begin in my own way.